It's my pleasure to introduce you Shannon Morris. I had the pleasure of having Shannon working with me for a short while, and it was really a great pleasure. She's a wonderful sonographer, sonographer, and she will, no one could be better than her in starting this day and taking you through the basic of ultrasound. Shannon.
Thank you, Katja. First, I want to say good morning as well and welcome to a dry Cape Town. It's a beautiful Cape Town, but a dry Cape Town. And Katja told you that we're going to give you a whole list of things that we're going to cover in the basic course today, but she failed to tell you that we're going to start even before then. It doesn't help you have the tools of how to do the scan, but you don't understand the physics of your ultrasound machine. And I can see by your faces you're going, physics at 8 o'clock in the morning. Well, there's nothing more frustrating than sitting in front of your ultrasound machine after you've seen the most amazing pictures that other people produce at the congresses and the workshops you go to, and you can't even blame the patient because she's not fat, and you just cannot get those images. So the purpose of this lecture then, at the end of the lecture, I hope to explain to you how is an ultrasound image generated, what are the different modes of ultrasound imaging, and I want to talk a little bit about the safety aspects of ultrasound. I get asked every day in my private practice, is this safe for my baby? So, to begin, we're going to talk about what ultrasound is. I'm going to try and explain to you as easily as I can how is a B mode real-time image produced, what are the effects of ultrasound on human tissue, and what is the ALARA principle. So, on this picture, we are supposed to have some animation here, some moving images. Well, on the picture on the right here, these little dots are meant to be moving, and they represent molecules moving, and that essentially is what sound is. Sound is the movement through a gas, a liquid, or a solid. And most of us think of sound really.
Yeah, but he wants it on. Martin says it has to.
Okay. So most of us think of sound as the barking of the dog or a screaming of a child, and that really is just vibrations in air. But sound can also move through a liquid and a solid. So if you're underwater and sound goes through the water, you can actually hear the sound, but in a different way. And the speed at which the sound travels is dependent on the phase in which it is and the temperature. So sound travels through air at about 343 meters per second, through water at about 1500 meters per second, and so on. And in biological tissue, in other words, the sound passing through our bodies, at about 1540 meters per second. And that is what your ultrasound machine is set to. Now we can actually represent this vibration of sound in a mathematical way as a sinusoidal waveform. I just want to show you that. Sorry about this. There we go. This is not the right size. I'm sorry about this. Okay, there we go. As a sinusoidal waveform. where the height of the sound, the amplitude, is the loudness of the sound. So the higher the sound, the louder, and the lower the sound, the lower the amplitude of the sound, the softer the sound. Now, sound to the human ear is between 20 and 1 and 20,000 megahertz per second. So the frequency of sound is measured as the number of cycles per second. And medical ultrasound is very high frequency sound, more between 1 and 20 megahertz. And on this graph here, you can see quite a broad spectrum of sound, where the lower frequencies of medical sound are used in the treatment of things like kidney stones. And we scan at about 2 to 20 megahertz. Now, we know something about the physics of sound now, but how actually is that sound generated? Well, in our ultrasound probes, there are very specialized crystals called piezoelectrical crystals. And they are made of quartz or modern ceramics. And when you apply a current to those crystals, they vibrate and create a sound wave. And this sound wave is then sent into the tissue and then returns to the probe and causes the probe to contract and relax and then cause a small electrical current. So there you can see applying a small electrical impulse to the ultrasound probe, causes it to compress, and it sends a signal into the tissue. And that tissue then reflects the sound, comes back to your piezoelectric crystal in your probe, creates a small electrical current, and that is then what your ultrasound uses to create an image. Now, the ultrasound probes, this is just a nice example of what it looks like, and these are these piezoelectric crystals inside the probe. And just on that note, I just want to say that that is probably one of the most expensive parts of your ultrasound machine. And I often come to the probe when I scan and I see people have left the gel caked all over the probe. They haven't cleaned it. There's a freeze button on your machine. When you don't push that freeze button, when you're not using that ultrasound probe, those crystals continue to vibrate there. So if you finish using ultrasound probe, put it back in its holder and push the freeze button. You will save the life of your probe. Underneath the probe, underneath the ultrasound machine, there are places to put the cable. If you let that cable lie on the floor and you ride over that cable with your ultrasound machine with the wheels, you will damage the probe. And if you drop the probe, you will also damage those crystals. And they are very expensive things to replace. So you have to look after your probe because it's very important. If you don't have that, you'll see nothing. So we've spoken about sound. We know the physics of sound. We know how the electricity travels through the probe, creates a signal. But how does the ultrasound machine actually generate a picture? So here, I hope this animation works now, is an ultrasound probe sending out a signal into the tissue. And nothing is being received by the probe because nothing is being reflected. Here is another signal being sent to a structure in a fragment of tissue or a rock or a kidney stone, and that sound is being reflected by that structure, and the probe receives a signal. Now, if you know the speed at which the signal is being sent, and you know how long it took for that sound signal to return to the ultrasound machine, you can actually calculate the depth of the structure. And that happens through this formula in that machine. And that reflector's depth, if you know that, it is represented as a dot on your ultrasound monitor. And the composition of many of these dots results in the production of an image. So here you can just see this depicted again. The ultrasound beam is being sent into the tissue. It gets reflected. And if you put many of these dots in a row, in a sequence, many signals being sent out, it results in the production of a picture. Okay, which is not on my slide. Okay. Now we know how the ultrasound image is generated, but there are two important aspects or settings in your machine that affect the production of this image. And the first thing is the width of the beam. So if you look at this picture on the left, there's quite a wide beam. And if you look at this one in the middle, the beam is narrower. So this image takes much quicker to produce than this one. This one is completed before that one because the angle is less. Another aspect that affects the production of the ultrasound image is the number of sectors. Now, the number of sectors on an ultrasound machine is the line densities. So the more sectors you screen or scan, the longer it takes to produce the image. The less sectors you have, the less time it takes. So there is another aspect that is really important, and that is the depth. The depth of an ultrasound is the time that it takes for the signal to return to the ultrasound transducer. So the closer the reflector is to your probe, the quicker the image is generated. The further away it is, the longer it takes for the image to be produced. So width takes time, depth takes time. So that is how B mode scanning works. What is M mode? There's another button on your machine called M mode. And the difference between M mode and B mode scanning is that with M mode, a single beam is being sended and received in a single line. So when you switch on your M mode, a single beam is sent down into a moving structure such as the heart. And the M mode is we use mostly in scanning the heart. And that is depicted as 4 dots on your ultrasound machine from the different reflectors within the heart. And if you apply time on the y-axis and you have a structure that is moving, then those dots will move up and down. So here you can see the line going through the heart, and this is the baby's lung tissue, and that is depicted by this straight line that is not moving. Whereas this line here is going through the crux of the heart, and you will see the line moves up and down, and that allows you to calculate the heart rate. So you would put a caliper over here and move it across there and calculate how many beats per minute. Now, before you can start, you actually also have to understand something about frequency, resolution, and penetration. And there is an inverse relationship between frequency and wavelength. So the higher the frequency, the shorter the wavelength. And the lower the frequency, the longer the wavelength. So these two women are exactly the same gestational age. But you're not going to use the same frequency transducer for this patient than you're going to use for this patient. Because if you use a very high frequency transducer for this patient, the sound doesn't travel very far, and you probably need much further to go down to see the baby. The price you pay for being able to see deeper is that the resolution on the machine is less. So high frequency transducers give you high resolution but a short wavelength, and they are the ones you preferably used in skinny Malini patients. And then lower frequency transducers are better for patients that have higher BMIs. So on this table here, you can actually see the different frequencies and more or less the depth that you can see at for each frequency. So what I want to do next with you is to teach you a few basic principles of ultrasound in order for you to understand the use of the machine and the post-processing software. So resolution, nowadays everybody has a digital camera and they understand resolution. But ultrasound has a different kind of resolution, 3 different kinds. And the first that I want to spend some time on is called lateral resolution. And that is the capability of the ultrasound machine to distinguish between 2 pixels on the screen in the same width as 2 separate structures. So on this picture here, you can see this dot, and that one. But here, it looks like one structure. So this image has lower resolution than this image. And that is lateral resolution. Axial resolution is the resolution in the axis of the ultrasound machine. So up and down. And temporal resolution is the capability to depict a moving structure in different consecutive ultrasound images. So if you have a high number of frames per second, each image will give you a small movement of a heart valve. But when you have low temporal resolution, you may not be able to see the different step of the moving structure. Another important thing to understand is how we can use tissue harmonics to enhance the image. These are very sophisticated buttons on quite expensive ultrasound machines. And through the laws of physics, there are frequencies that are twice and 3 times and so forth the strength of the original frequency that went into the tissue. And tissue harmonics is where it allows the ultrasound probe to receive these signals, these other signals, that are at higher frequency to improve the resolution of the machine. So when you switch your tissue harmonics on, it results in a better image. But the price that you pay for that is that you have less penetration and decreased axial resolution. Artifacts. So this is something that you must take note of. And artifacts are things the ultrasound machine or image produces that are really not there. I mean, this boat is not really flying. And there are 4 kinds of artifacts that are commonly produced that you need to know about. The first one is dropout or acoustic shadowing. And this is particularly important also when you're scanning the fetal heart. It can create the illusion of a perimembranous VSD. So it's a hypoechoic area that is posterior to a dense reflector. So here you can see the fetal face. Bone is very dense. All the ultrasound energy has been used, and there's less to go through to the back, and it gives you these lines that go across the baby's face. And it's most marked along the ultrasound beam. So how can you overcome this? Well, you need to change the angle of insonation. You need to come from a different angle. And the same is so when you're examining the fetal heart. So if the heart is completely in an apical view and the ultrasound beams are coming down the septum, you often get an area just below the valves where it looks like there could be a VSD. But if you come with your transducer from a different angle, then you can see, well, that septum is actually intact. Posterior enhancement or amplification is where the ultrasound beams now travel through an echolucent area, and the area behind that appears brighter. And therefore there's there's more ultrasound left after it's passed through this, and you get an attenuation of tissue behind the echolucent area. And that can maybe make you think there's a mass behind this structure. And the way to overcome that is to change also the angle of intonation, to come from a different angle. Reverberation occurs when ultrasound beams encounters two strong parallel reflectors, and there are multiple echoes that pass backwards and forwards between these reflectors, creating the illusion of a second line. And it's probably the easiest to show you in this image. So here the ultrasound beams are traveling through the uterus to the myometrium, and they are being reflected back. Here they are being sent in, reflected, and then sent back and reflected, and that line is represented as a shadow down here. So this line here is really representing that line there in the myometrium. And the way to overcome this, especially in patients with a low BMI, is to turn down your gain or to put less energy into the machine. We are going to be talking about the buttons of the ultrasound machine just now, but change the angle of intonation also works, turn down the gain and turn down the power. The last artifact I think you need to know something about is the so-called side lobe artifact, and this results from echoes that lie outside the incident beam, outside the central incident beam. And these echoes are reflected and they are displayed as though they are originating from the central beam. So here, this structure looks like a bony spur that is part of the limb here, but it actually doesn't exist. It's a side lobe artifact. And the way to overcome that is also to change the angle of intonation or turn down the gain. The last part of my talk is something about the safety aspects of ultrasound. We know ultrasound is safe, but with the movement of molecules, you get a rise in temperature, and you are heating the tissue. And when ultrasound beams hit a gas bubble, it causes collapse or cavitation with a shock wave and the creation of more warmth. Now, there are many international societies that have guidelines on the safety of ultrasound, but I don't know if any of you have ever looked on the footprint of your ultrasound machine. On the monitor, there's something that says TI and MI. I don't know if you've ever looked at that, but the next time you sit in front of your ultrasound machine, have a look at that. And the thermal index is the power needed to increase the temperature by 1 degree, and that should never be more than 1. And the mechanical index is the negative pressure divided by the core frequency, and that should also never be more than 1. And the ALARA principle is very important. It means that you need to scan with as low energy as possible for the reasonable, achievable time to answer the clinical question that you are looking at. So, if you're doing an anomaly scan, you need to scan for as long as it takes for you to measure all the things you need to measure, check where the placenta is, the fluid, and do the anatomy. It is not a good idea to do fun scans, just to have a look at the baby. The reason for scanning is to answer a clinical question. And here you can see, and I just wanted to say that most ultrasound machines are preset to the correct mechanical and thermal index. So if you scan at a thermal index of 1, you can see that after the first trimester, shouldn't scan for longer than 60 minutes. And the higher the thermal index, obviously, the less time you should be exposing the fetus to ultrasound. Now, the different modes of ultrasound have different heating potentials because they use a lot of ultrasound. And sometimes we are scanning the heart with color and Doppler and B mode. So this is really important when we're scanning in the first trimester, in really small fetuses. I often see patients who come to me they've had a scan in the first trimester, and they take out a picture, and somebody's actually measured the heart rate with Doppler at 8 weeks. Please do not use Doppler in to calculate the fetal heart rate or to show the parents that the baby's heart is beating under 10 weeks. It's enough for you to see the heart moving, or otherwise, if you want to calculate the heart rate because you think the baby might have a bradycardia, use M mode. And here are some links, websites that you can click on or visit to see the different safety guidelines and statements by different international organizations. So I hope you understand how an ultrasound beam is produced. I hope you know how to recognize artifacts now and how to avoid them. If you're uncertain about whether you're obtaining an artifact or whether what you're seeing is real, change the angle of incination, and always be aware of how much time you're exposing the fetus to and the mechanical and the thermal index.